Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C. to have a conversation with Heidi Hardt, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. You're in town for the NATO 70th anniversary celebrations, in part because of your fascinating new book, NATO's Lessons in Crisis, Institutional Memory in International Organizations, a follow-on to your first book, Time to Learn, Time to React, excuse me, both of which are available on Amazon, so buy liberally for your friends for the holidays. Talk to us a little bit. You know, it's an utterly fascinating topic because we're in a world where institutions are moving ever faster, paces of change are faster, people are moving in and out of jobs, so it's not as common where folks will stay in a job for a long period of time. You have contractors that complicate that. Militaries are a little bit better, but international organizations tend not to be as good on how you collectively remember lessons, strategic lessons in particular. Talk to us about what drove you to focus on this area now in two books, but also what some of your key findings were.
So I was motivated to look at this question of institutional memory and how is it that anyone retains any knowledge given that you have so much turnover in these types of organizations. Largely by the first book, which you mentioned, Time to React, in which I interviewed a large number of ambassadors. And many of the ambassadors who were involved in decision-making on peacekeeping mentioned to me that it was unfortunate that after they left, a lot of the knowledge that they were walking around with was just going to be gone. And so I found it quite surprising that that information was not somehow automatically or institutionally in some way passed on, and wanted to know, is that true in all organizations? What does that look like in particular in a military context? So the question that drives this book, NATO's Lessons in Crisis, is how is it that an organization like NATO, like you said, so much turnover, a very strong culture of rapid reaction, thinking forward all the time. How is it that an organization like that retains any knowledge at all, particularly at the strategic level? And so what I did is I went out and I interviewed 120 NATO officials, civilian and military, almost all of the ambassadors, almost all of the military representatives, individuals in ACO, ACT, so all aspects of this organization, to understand how that knowledge is getting passed on, particularly in the area of crisis management. And what I found was quite surprising. I had walked in anticipating that because it's a military organization, we would expect to find that it is largely formally institutionalized. You have a lessons learned office called the JALC at NATO that exists for the purpose of retaining information and making sure that it's disseminated. But actually, most of the people that I interviewed don't read the JALC reports. Most of them don't contribute to those reports, and it sounded like the JALC itself is quite siloed. And so instead, what I found was that the large majority of the institutional memory in this organization is largely driven by these informal networks that exist among individuals, and in particular, a few key individuals who largely tended to be British, largely tended to be people who could communicate between the civilian side of the house and the military side of the house. Those were key individuals that people would call up when they wanted to know, hey, I'm planning this operation in Libya, and you were there for Kosovo. Could you tell me what really happened? And I think that networks work so well, largely because it operates on trust. And so people can be more forthcoming, say, in person or by phone than they can, say, in reports, which often are very heavily vetted.
And tell everybody what a JALC is for those people who don't know what that is.
Sure. So the JALC is NATO's Joint Analysis Lessons Learned Center. So it's located out in the suburbs of Lisbon in Portugal. And it's dedicated to try to capture lessons at the strategic, operational, and tactical level. But one of the big findings there was that it functions very well at the tactical level and somewhat at the operational level, but that strategic lessons they really struggled with getting. And I would argue for those who are out in the defense community who are thinking about how can we improve institutional memory in our own organizations, you really need to think about incentives. And unfortunately, the way that the JALC is designed within NATO is such that the individuals that work there lack the autonomy that, say, someone in the Army Lessons Learned Center has to be able to go out and try to track down lessons on their own, or say, while an operation is ongoing, go out and interview people and try to find out, in the field, what are the lessons that really matter. Unfortunately, the JALC is very demand-driven, which means that they can't capture lessons unless they are specifically tasked with doing so. And so then even after they've been tasked with, go write a report on Libya, strategic lessons of Libya. So let's say you get lucky enough to get that tasking, you think that's really important, you work at the JALC, then that report is very highly likely to be heavily vetted. So then even when it gets distributed, it's not necessarily reflecting the realities of what happened because of these political concerns. So I think like I said, for the defense community, you need to be thinking about making sure that those reporting mechanisms are such that there's a way that everyone in the organization can report about, what they perceive to be errors or failures in some capacity in an anonymous way. And then also making sure that those reports then ultimately become available to the wide community, because that was another thing that I heard repeatedly from civilian and military actors within the organization. Just this frustration with the fact that we can't, some of us don't even have access to certain reports that are classified, et cetera.
Well, look, life is all about incentives, right? So it's either about electricity or cheese, like the pain and the reward. So what are some mechanisms to use? Because organizations regularly try to do this to incentivize people to whether to cooperate or record lessons. But ultimately, everybody's busy. They've got real-world tasks. It's like, okay, hey, we looked that problem, we fixed that problem. We're moving on to the next one. And then it is very much a case where somebody calls you up 10 or 15 years later and says, hey, look, we're doing this new operation. Can you walk me through what you experienced as I'm trying to do that? General officers do that very, very frequently. We had a chance to talk to General Clark, Wes Clark, the former SACEUR, who was there during Bosnia. What were some of the lessons and the similarities, for example, between Bosnia and what could have been done, for example, in Syria? So talk to us about those incentives and the rewards and the potential punishments that organizations need to set up in order to be able to record these important lessons.
Absolutely. So first I would encourage people to go buy the book, because in the conclusion chapter, if you want to cheat and just zoom ahead, there's a list of policy recommendations. And I think those policy recommendations are relevant for anyone who's working in a military context or doing any work with stability operations, crisis management operations, and wants to think about this more. So check that out. But in that chapter, I talk a little bit about how there are formal things that you can do and informal things. So formally, you can do something as simple as requiring individuals in an organization to leave behind an exit document. And so that just provides, short summary. I was quite surprised to see in NATO that is not standard across the organization. There's huge variation in terms of who does that. Just a quick document that provides some information about, things that worked well, things that didn't. Also, informally, making sure that the person who's outgoing and the person who's incoming have each other's contact information. That's really, really key. So one of the things that was really surprising to me, and I think matters a lot for institutional memory, is that individuals who did have each other's contact, who did have that opportunity to be able to speak either in person during an overlap or, say, on the phone, that they were able to communicate with each other about people within the organization that helped them get things done. So, when I asked that question, I had a survey that everybody got the same question about, all sorts of aspects of knowledge and how it's passed on. One of the questions was, what's the, most important piece of information that you received from your predecessor? And the answer was people. Who do I go to get things done? And who are the people, that maybe did not help me get things done? And that kind of information, I think it's really difficult to get from a report, right? There's a lot of reputational risk in putting those names down. But if you can create a system where every individual that leaves and every individual that's coming in has each other's contact information, has an opportunity to communicate, you can make sure that there's that privacy and that, it's a risk-free opportunity for two people to be able to have an open conversation and pass on that knowledge.
The person to approach is as important as avoiding the person that is an impediment, right? And that's true for almost sadly, for any organization. How can this be sort of more broadly societally applied, right? I mean, you see the same sort of thing of much higher turnover rates in companies. There are a little bit less so in government, but it's still a government challenge. I know that you've looked at this more broadly than just this part of, you know, I mean, obviously NATO is a very important part of it, in part because of the International Civil Service. I mean, that's what we were talking about last night. And check out our coverage of the NATO Engages event. It was sponsored by the Atlantic Council, German Marshall Fund, and Munich Security Conference, and was an extraordinary event on this, the 70th anniversary of the Atlantic Alliance, the Washington Treaty, where 12 nations came together to form the nucleus of what is now a 29-nation alliance that's been the most successful in history. But, you know, talk to us a little bit about the lessons and how actually what you're studying is applicable, you know, across the board, and how institutions need to think of that, right? At least military people are more disciplined. There's, you know, a culture of learning and, you know, hey, what, you know, how do we do lessons learned? Whereas actually for some companies, it's actually, you know, when people leave, that entire intellectual capital goes, and there isn't a lot of framework there. You know, you've got to start from scratch when you're rebuilding the replacement.
Right. I completely agree that this is a problem that is applicable to society writ large, right? For people who study organizations, you know, organizational learning is a very challenging aspect that people are trying to figure out how to deal with, especially in companies. But I would say that there is some importance in thinking about what are things that as a company or as an organization that you can do to incentivize people. So as I was saying, incentives are really important. You know, another thing is making sure that people are there in a job long enough so that they accumulate enough knowledge that they can be relevant to other individuals within the organization. So it's not just about making sure that you know, have the information being passed on to the next person and the exit documents, like I said, in the conversations. But, you know, if the person who is in that job is only there for a few years, you know, there's not incentives for other individuals to seek out his or her knowledge about some particular incident. So, you know, examples, I use the example of, you know, Kosovo and Libya, but there's also examples now, you know, Afghanistan. This is an operation that NATO's been involved with it for more than a decade, right? But unfortunately, NATO now is struggling because a lot of the people who were on indefinite job contracts, which is, you know, in academia, we would call that tenure, are now retiring out of the organization. And that's really difficult because the job contracts themselves are now, due to budget cuts, are now only 3 years in length, with possibly the option of getting an extension for an additional third. And then, you know, I've sort of heard that possibly there's some people that may still get indefinite contracts. But just to say that I think it's really important that you make sure that someone is in a job for at least ideally 5 years or so, because not only do you want that person to be able to figure out how to do the job and do it well, but you also want to be able to attract and recruit talented people. We were talking about that last night as well, is that, you know, some people, you know, people have families, people want to settle down for a little bit. And if you, which is very characteristic of many different positions in the military and, you know, different organizations, if you're only there for 3 years, as I heard time and time again by military and civilian officials at NATO, you spend the first year figuring out the job, spend the second year doing the job, spend the third year looking for your next job. And so that, I think that's problematic. So just doing something as simple as extending job contracts, if it's possible, to about 5 years or so, seeing if you can set up overlap, ideally, say, a week or so. We know it's always better. You know, literature says this as well. My first book was evidences this as well, the importance of face-to-face contact and people being able to speak openly. If you can do some overlap, and then, you know, that's just those simple little tweaks can make a huge difference for allowing a pre-existing informal network. I mean, every organization already has informal networks, but allowing those to flow and have the information flow as efficiently as possible.
You know, how important, though, is the experience that people have before even they go into this job? I know that this is a question that's arisen. You know, everybody wants to harness young talent. We heard that from Admiral Nielsen, the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, where he said, like, look, you know, in certain cases, I'd like to, like, get rid of half my staff and actually have younger people doing it. There are benefits to that, but we're also seeing, for example, on complex programs and other things where a new generation of people have come in. that don't necessarily have that experience base, then you actually set up a situation where you're struggling. So you get some of the advantages of new thinking, but then don't have that deep experience, especially when it comes to military operations or even engineering or other fields. Tech firms are actually suffering a little bit from that also, because some of the more seasoned engineers tend to be a little bit on the older side. You know, what are ways that you can make sure that people have the right experience, skill sets even before they get into these jobs? Because we have a tendency of sort of being, you know, it's up and out, so everybody's always moving around and getting promoted to jobs. Whereas I think if you went back in history, some of the people who got the key jobs were really vetted and had those right skill sets before they took over critical assignments.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about really is context dependent. So, you know, if it's obviously some sort of job that requires very technical skills, then you want to make sure that that person has the education and training prior to coming into that position that, you know, matches with that position as advertised. So, I mean, what you're talking about, I think, is more a call for making sure that job descriptions are very specific. Now, because I also do work on gender, I would put in a caveat by saying that we do know that research shows that women and men look at job opportunities differently. Because men and women are socialized from a very young age for men to be more, to be less risk averse and women to be more risk averse. Women tend to look at job contracts and look at those list of skills and say, oh, you know, I don't have, you know, I have most of those skills, but I don't have all of them, so I'm not going to apply for a job. Whereas men look at, you know, a job and say, oh, I've got, you know, 25%, 50%, okay, probably more than 25%, but I've got, you know, most of those skills, and then they'll apply.
I know people who have no skills and apply to complicated jobs, but anyway.
Yeah, so I'm saying, you know, from the perspective of the employer, you want to make sure that you're specific enough to include the things that you really, really need, but you don't want to be so detailed that then you're driving away diverse, really talented people. So there is a trade-off there, but I think once you've figured out that balance and you've gotten the talent into your organization, then it's just really key that you make sure that you can keep him or her in that position for an ideal, like I said, you know, at least 5 or 6 years. I am certainly not with this book arguing that we should bring back indefinite contracts. I think for an organization like NATO, that was tried in the past. They had a lot of difficulties there because, like you were saying, that there are some advantages to bringing in new talent, new skills. And so in an ideal situation, you have people that are on job contracts of, like I said, at least 5 or 6 years, so that they're in there long enough to retain that knowledge, to really become experts in their area, ideally pass it on to their successor, but then move out before they start getting to a situation where their skills are not as relevant anymore.
Talk to us a little bit about methodology and how you did this, because I think that for any academic endeavor, we have a lot of analysts here, so talk to us about how you did this to ensure that you got the best possible result.
I'll start by saying I have a background in journalism, which I found very useful because one of the key things that you learn in journalism is the importance of persistence. So for academics, analysts who are really interested in doing large numbers of interviews, as in this case 120 interviews in a short period of time, you really need to follow up with people. You can't expect that if you send one email requesting an interview with someone, people are going to follow up with that, even if you know someone who knows someone who knows someone. It just doesn't work that way. As you said, especially we're talking, we're all people here who are in the security and defense sector, and everyone, has a go, go, go type mentality because it's a rapidly moving world. It's a dynamic context. So I think it's important to do follow-ups. So in my case, I made sure that every 3 days after I'd send an email, I sent another email. After that, then I would do a phone call. And I was always very polite and respectful because I want to respect people's time. But being persistent and saying, this is a project that I think is really important and I'd be grateful for, 45 minutes to an hour of your time. And so that's how I was able to actually get those one-on-one interviews. Almost all of them were in person, but there were some at the end that were done by phone. But once people understood the project, in some cases, sometimes people ask a few questions about could you give some example questions? I think people are often very happy to talk about themselves.
Exactly. Otherwise, we would not have jobs as journalists such as we have them. Next book, are you already scoping out your next book?
Yes, I have several different projects in the works right now, but one of them is looking at what are the drivers of actual change in organizations? So, my first book looked at speed of response. How do we, think about getting organizations to, be more efficient with their activities? In that case, it was looking at peacekeeping. Second book, Institutional Memory, says, how do you retain knowledge about some of those operations? And then the third book is going to look at, okay, so, we have that knowledge. We have some understanding of how to try to retain it. Now, what do we do with that? How do we use that to try to help us really change an organization in a fundamental way? So a co-author of mine and I, Professor Emily Ritter, and I are putting together a big data set on structural reforms in international organizations, ranging from NATO to European Union to the African Union.
Fascinating, and of course you're a University of Southern California Annenberg School graduate, which is one of the best journalism schools in the country. Heidi, thanks very much. Absolute pleasure. Heidi Hardt, Associate Professor of Political Science. Assistant.
Hopefully soon to be associate.
Oh, very good. Sorry, I've got my fingers crossed. Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. Thanks very much. Absolute pleasure, and look forward to staying in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.